World Food Program says the situation in Gaza is catastrophic and calls for more aid to be let through. I'm joined now by Shamil Idriss. He is CEO of Search for Common Ground, a peacekeeping group based in Washington, D.C. Shamil, great to see you again. So how concerned are you about the growing humanitarian situation unfolding in Gaza?
Thank you, Fred, for having me. It's terrifying, both for the current condition and the people who are suffering, and also for the prospects of us getting out of this and getting to a place where nothing like this will ever happen again. And you know, you have to say, and I've learned in discussing particularly this conflict, you have to start with something that seems obscenely obvious, but unfortunately oftentimes isn't. None of the Israeli civilians who were wounded or murdered or abducted 2 weeks ago, and none of the Palestinian civilians who are cowering in terror and weak from hunger, from having been cut off from food and water, none of the civilians deserves this or had it coming. And again, it seems obscene to have to say that, but you have to start there. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think if we're going to get out of this, there has to be, first and foremost, an end to the violence against civilians before we can move on to what's next.
Except until that happens, there are people who need basic sustenance, food, water, medicine. There were about 20 truckloads that made it through the Rafah border today. Surely not enough for some 2 million people who are in Gaza, and we don't really know how many people are in the greatest need right now. So what are your concerns about how what has been delivered will be distributed, and how much longer people can go without more?
Well, you know, we have to recognize it's a positive step. It's a very small step. It's a positive step. And all those who are responsible for enabling this to go forward, President Biden, President Sisi of Egypt, frankly, if this aid gets all the way through to the people who actually need it, both the Israeli military and Hamas also are enabling this to happen. So all who are enabling this to happen, it's a positive step. But then we have to recognize the World Health Organization has just told us that they need 100 trucks a day to prevent catastrophe, not 20 trucks every 2 weeks. So that is the first issue. And this is part of the larger issue, Fred, of preventing violence against civilians. All of the violence against civilians, by far, the majority of people who have suffered from this violence are civilians, both in Israel and in Palestine. The siege, the cutting off of food, water, medications, the taking of hostages, the far too much of the missile damage, both that fired from Hamas and those fired from Israel, are landing on sites that are clearly out of bounds by any rules of war, schools and refugee camps and hospitals, and you know, it's houses of worship, residences. So this has to stop. There has to be, you know, after this aid is delivered, there has to be relentless pressure from the international community to enable more aid to get in and to prevent more civilian deaths and casualties. And then we can look to what happens next, because if we're going to ever get out of this, what we really need ultimately is an actual political process, a genuine and inclusive political process, which we really haven't had for a good 2 decades or more on this conflict.
In what ways do you feel you and your organization are able to help, or perhaps what are the frustrations that are standing in the way of you being able to assist in the ways that you can?
You know, I appreciate you having me on, because there haven't been enough people on mainstream media who have genuine experience with peace building, including on the ground by teams from both communities. And one of the things that infuriates me and my other colleagues in the entire sort of peace building community is you pump a conflict like this full of hate speech and military assistance and securitized approaches, and you know, billions of dollars over all these years, and you put hundreds of thousands of dollars into peace building and really no effort into a genuine political solution. And then when everything goes to hell, you say, oh, I guess peace building doesn't work. Enough. That's just not the case. You know, this conflict is particularly complex. I get that. I don't know any other conflict that people go back 3,000 years and have the religious symbolism and all of that. But it's made a lot harder to solve when you actually ignore the basics. Forget the complexity for a second. And the basics of any conflict is you resolve the conflict by generating a peace process that involves the parties. There hasn't been a genuine effort at a peace process that was inclusive. There have been diplomatic breakthroughs between Israel and other states in the Arab world, which is wonderful. But those have not been a substitute. Not only have those not been a substitute for delivering a genuine Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement that can be durable, but all the time that those breakthroughs have happened, the situation on the ground has actually worsened substantially. This was already the deadliest year in over a decade in this conflict before this war ever broke out. And with more housing demolitions as well, and violence between settlers and Palestinians, and confiscations. And so that is, we have to address that, or this will be just the latest chapter, not the end of violence.
And then I wonder quickly, do you see the U.S. playing a significant role in helping to broker the peace that continues to remain absent?
The U.S. has already played a role in helping to open up this humanitarian corridor, but we are in touch with people all over the world in communities in conflict, and the credibility of the U.S., I can't remember a time when it was this low. It was heartening to hear President Biden talk about not being blinded by rage when one wants to strike back after attacks, just as he mentioned the experience of the United States during 9/11. But people need to see more. They need to see a concerted effort to get the humanitarian assistance in at the level that it's required, and a genuine effort to address the civilian casualties on both sides, and not simply call it collateral damage. The proportions are simply way out of measure to simply call it collateral damage. It's much more than that.
All right, Shamil Idriss, thank you so much. Great to see you again, sadly under these kinds of circumstances, but appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.